Hello and welcome to this webinar highlighting the results from the first PISA assessment of students' well-being. Andreas Schleicher, Director of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills, will present the key findings of the 2015 assessment, which were published today. He will also be available to answer your questions at the end of his presentation. Please feel free to send your questions to Eric Magnuson via the chat function at any time during the presentation. Andreas?
Perhaps the most important PISA report that we have published so far, because it really broadens the view of learning outcomes at school to include some of the social and emotional aspects that are so important. Schools are not just places where students learn about math and history, but they're also places where students discover the diversity of our societies and their experiences in school to frame much of their life later on. When we looked at well-being in the context of PISA, we looked at cognitive aspects. Obviously, learning outcomes, academic outcomes are still always an important facet of student well-being because they shape future life chances in decisive way. But we also started to look at some of the psychological attributes, some of the social, the relational attributes in education, and finally also physical well-being among students. So the first question that we ask ourselves is, how satisfied are students with their lives? And we found some really interesting data on that. I'm going to show you them here. This is the share, the proportion of 15-year-olds who are satisfied with their life. And the first thing that you can see, some of the countries that did highest on the PISA test, like Korea, like Hong Kong, like China, actually don't come out that strongly on that index of life satisfaction. But when you look at this, you may ask yourself, well, maybe we have to choose between educating children well and having them leading happy lives. But in fact, you find other high-performing education systems like Finland, like the Netherlands, like Switzerland, like Estonia, where you can actually see learning outcomes are very strong and life satisfaction is highly developed as well. So this is actually the first important lesson from the report, that actually some countries do succeed in combining good learning outcomes with a high degree of life satisfaction. There's also a share of students who are clearly not satisfied with their life. In many countries, it's at least 1 in 10. So that is also something I'm going to look at later on in greater detail, what lies behind that. When we ask ourselves, what drives satisfaction with life, it's basically students who talk or meet with friends after schools, students who enjoy high levels of teacher support, good parental support, more physical activity. Those attributes all relate to higher levels of life satisfaction. When we look at those who are unhappy with their life, it's often anxiety with schoolwork, anxiety with preparing for the next test. It's also an extreme level of internet use, where students use the internet, like more than 6 hours per day. You can really see much lower levels of life satisfaction. So that's the overall general picture that emerges from this report. I want to just highlight once again that this is not about a trade-off between life satisfaction and learning outcomes. In fact, you can see almost no relationship among the two when you look at this chart. There are some countries where student performance is low in terms of science learning outcomes here, and also life satisfaction is low. But, you do have countries where you can see the learning outcomes that are good and the degree of life satisfaction that is very positive. So that's on that aspect. We do see important gender differences. That's also important. When you look at the students who are more satisfied with their lives, basically marked in green here, you can see that it's prevalent among boys. So the students who are more satisfied tend to be more boys, and the students who are less satisfied tend to be more girls. And that's a picture that we see across countries. We've not been able to relate that clearly to school factors. There may well be out-of-school factors. These are 15-year-olds. They may have certain views on their lives. But the magnitude of the gender differences does suggest that we should just be aware of this. something that teachers should be aware, parents should be aware, schools should be aware. And as you can see, take a high performer like Finland. Overall life satisfaction is very strong, but it's much stronger among boys than it is among girls. I already mentioned the use of ICT as a factor that may detract from life satisfaction. You can see that clearly in this data. When you have students who are extreme internet users, spending more than 6 hours per day online, you can see they tend to feel lonely at school. You can also see that they often are isolated in school. Other students leave me out of things on purpose. They arrive late in school, according to what they tell us, and also they expect school to leave school as quickly as they can after compulsory education. So you can really see some of the patterns, and they're quite consistent across countries. We've also seen that online activities have markedly increased since 2012. The blue bar here represents the number of minutes that students spend per day online. And you can see it is in some countries, 3 hours, Chile, Sweden, Uruguay, Costa Rica, Spain, very, very high levels. And then in 2012, that's the yellow diamond, those levels were quite a bit lower. So that's obviously a trend that is new that we have seen in recent years, and but quite consistent across countries. So when you look at the OECD average, you talk about, 140, 145 minutes spent on average every school day. And as I said, that's still moderate, but you do have a significant share, almost a quarter of students in some countries that spend more than 6 hours per day, with the kind of adverse effects that you have seen in these data. We also see that boys and girls use technology quite differently. Now, when you look at this by gender, you can see that boys are much more active playing online games. When it comes to chatting online, that's pretty much balanced between boys and girls. When it comes to participation in social networks, there you can see actually girls being that is more prevalent among girls. So it's not just, volume, is also the nature of activities that varies by gender. And it's again something, for parents, for teachers to be aware of. We also ask students to what extent they are dependent on the internet, and you can see rates of dependencies are quite high in some countries. You look at Chinese Taipei, you look at Sweden, you look at France, at Greece, at Singapore. There you can say basically 8 out of 10 girls say that they feel bad if they're not online, not connected to the internet. Among boys, sometimes a little bit lower, sometimes a little bit higher. Not so much of a gender gap here, but you can see internet dependency quite high in some countries, whereas countries like Slovenia, Estonia, Germany, and so on, there you don't see that very much as a phenomenon, just about 40% of the So variable across countries, but overall is again something that we should be aware of. Now, the big question behind the report obviously is, what can society do about this? What is the role of teachers and what can schools do? And I already mentioned one of the factors that links quite clearly negatively to life, the quality of life of students is anxiety with schoolwork. So reducing anxiety with schoolwork is a clear kind of policy objective. When you look at the average, you can see that more than half of the students often worry that it will be difficult for them to take a test. And what's so interesting, this doesn't relate to the prevalence of tests. We found no relationship between test anxiety and the number of tests that students have to do. So that is not about the volume of testing. It's about other factors that drive that anxiety. Most importantly, the perception of students that teachers really help and support them. You can also see that 65% of students who worry that they will get poor grades at school. And these are not just the students who actually get poor grades. You have actually in some countries a very high share of even high performers also worrying about poor grades. Over half of the students say that they feel anxious even if they're well prepared for a test and so on. I get nervous when I don't know how to solve the task at school. So what you can see from this is really that significant share of students often feel left alone, they worry, they are not feeling personally supported in their learning needs. You know, the teacher may teach a great lesson to a whole class, but many students feel left out, anxious in that kind of process. And I'm showing you the OECD average here. In some of the countries, levels of anxiety are much, much higher. Here I show you, because, you know, I think that link with performance is so important. In green, you can see actually anxiety levels even among the highest performers in science. These are the top 25% of students, and you can see actually this anxiety can be very high, you know, particularly in Latin America, Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Brazil, Colombia, Uruguay, but also Singapore, the United Kingdom. Test anxiety is very, very high. What's so interesting is you look at the other end of the spectrum, you know, Switzerland, Germany, they do quite well on the test. Most students get good results. Actually, expectations on students are quite high, but levels of anxieties are actually quite moderate. In some of those countries, students are not so much motivated by competitive pressures or pressures from the outside. What you can actually see is that they have very high aspirations for themselves. They have a higher degree of intrinsic motivation, and we actually find that that is a good safeguard against anxiety, while at the same time being a good predictor for being really engaged with learning and being ambitious. You know, level of ambition is a predictor for better outcomes. You can see student motivation being related to better outcomes in important ways, but it's this kind of external motivation, extrinsic motivation, competitive motivation that can actually be conducive to anxiety. No? When you look at the bottom quarter of science performance, levels of anxiety tend to be higher. Now that's obviously, you know, when you're not doing well in school, you probably get more worried about it. But it's not the case everywhere. Now look at the Netherlands, another high-performing education system. Anxiety levels are not very high among top performers, and they're not very high among bottom performers. So again, there are some interesting lessons we can learn from those kinds of countries. Highlight again, you know, Switzerland, Netherlands, Finland, Estonia as countries that do well on the test, that have high levels of life satisfaction. You can see here actually levels of anxiety are quite moderate. Now, one factor that we found quite importantly related to life satisfaction is the support that that students perceive. We have no measure to actually, you know, quantify the level of support that teachers give students, personal support. But we ask students themselves, you know, to what extent do you think your teacher knows what you can be doing? To what extent does your teacher actually adapt the lesson to your learning needs, helps you when you need help? So it's the perceived support. And what you can see is in relatively happy schools, and by this I mean schools where life satisfaction is above the OECD average, you can see that in the green bars, the teacher support index is actually positive, at least in most countries. So you can really see that where there is a perception that teachers are supportive, in those schools, life satisfaction tends to be higher. When you look at unhappy schools, schools where students do not feel such a high degree of life satisfaction, you can see there's a tendency for teacher support to be less. So this is actually another really important lesson, that the perceived support that students feel is very strongly related to some of the outcomes. We do not know what the causal nature of that relationship is. It can obviously go in both ways. There can be third factors involved. But simply seeing that, you know, the supportive environment, that the role of teachers is not just to convey academic content, but also to create an environment in which students feel empowered, own their learning, positively motivated, not anxious, is really something that is an important part of the picture of teachers. And some countries devote a lot of time to this. Now, the work organization in schools very much supports teachers. There's a lot of emphasis in professional development. Where teachers receive a lot of training in cognitive psychology to understand that students learn differently and that students may need individual support. Here you can see that sort of at the aggregate level. On the left side, I show you two positive factors. Now, the teacher adapts the lesson to my class's needs, knowledge. The teacher provides individual help when a student has difficulties understanding a topic or task. And on the right side, I show you two negative factors. Fairness. The teacher graded me harder than they graded other students. Perception, you know, my teacher doesn't treat me fairly. or the teacher gave me the impression that he thinks or she thinks that I'm less smart than I really am. And now you can see the sense of anxiousness. Now, even when I'm well prepared for a test, I feel anxious. You can see that is less likely to happen for students where teachers are supportive, and more likely to happen where students perceive their teachers to be less supportive, unfair, or not recognizing their abilities. And when you look at, tenseness when studying, you can see those effects even larger. So again, teacher support is a quite good predictor for a reduced level of anxiety. Let's look a little bit at motivation, which we found another really important factor. We asked students not only how motivated they are, but also what motivates them. You can see about 80% of students, more than 80% students want top grades in most or all of their courses. And more than 90% of the students want to be able to select among the best opportunities when they graduate. Where things differ more across countries is the level of competitive motivation. For example, you have about 60% who want to be the best students in their class, but in some countries that is very low, and in other countries that is very high. I see myself as an ambitious person. True for 70% of the students, and this level of ambition seems to be a very important positive predictor for better outcomes. So the reasons for motivation among students are different, and the extrinsic and intrinsic factors also vary between countries, which tells us something about, the culture of learning, the culture of education. Why is, higher achievement motivation important? It's actually one of the best predictors for student resilience. By resilience, I mean students who succeed academically even if they come from very disadvantaged backgrounds. It's basically defined as the likelihood of someone coming from the bottom quarter of the social economic distribution to reach the top quarter of students among all countries for which we have comparative data. It's basically the likelihood that you succeed despite coming from disadvantage. Now what you can see here is that actually there is a big difference in achievement motivation between resilient and non-resilient students. So the relationship between motivation and resilience is very important. These data do suggest how important it is for teachers and schools to strengthen student ownership for learning, their sense of self-efficacy, their sense that they can overcome difficulties and that they get this high level of motivation. Now, the caveat I want to make, I said motivation is very important, but when it comes down to simply competitive motivation, I want to be one of the best students in my class, I want to be better than my fellow students, there you can actually see that is also an important predictor of test anxiety, something that relates negatively to outcomes and life satisfaction. So it's actually quite tricky how to get the motivational factors right. You look at sort of the intrinsic factors strengthened and the extrinsic factors reduced, so that actually this relationship that you can see here is not that pronounced. And you can see again, look at the three top performers, high learning outcomes, Estonia, Finland, Switzerland, high levels of life satisfaction, low levels of anxiety, and there's also not such a strong sense of, competitive motivation. You look at, let's see, the United States is another example of a country where you can see actually there's a high degree of competitive motivation and also a high degree of anxiety. The United States could probably do better in giving students a greater sense of ownership for their learning and motivating them intrinsically. That's basically what we see. Anxiety is reduced through more intrinsic factors of motivation and can be increased through extrinsic factors. The question really is for teachers in teaching and learning to get that balance right. Now, I want to come to one aspect that has been very important to us, and that is student sense of belonging at school and the relations with teachers. Because we actually, as I showed you at the beginning, see that that is a very important predictor of life satisfaction. Schools are a place where students experience the diversity of our societies and where they can actually, where the degree to which students from different social backgrounds feel a sense of belonging is quite important. And you can see that varies quite a bit across countries. In Spain and Austria and Albania, Switzerland, you can see very high degrees of student sense of belonging. Whereas in Turkey and Macau, China, and the Dominican Republic, and Russia and Thailand, that sense is much less developed. So it's interesting to see that students, do I make friends in my school? How do my teachers treat me? Is school a place where I feel at home? Those factors are ones that actually vary, not just between schools, but also quite significantly across countries on the index for which we have measured this. One of the things that we observed, and I can't give you a clear explanation for this, unfortunately, is that the sense of belonging among students has significantly declined since we started to measure this in 2003. You can see, for example, I feel like an outsider. That was quite high in 2003, then got less in 2012, and much less in 2015. I make friends easily at school. You can see in 2015 again, the levels are lowest. In 2003, that sense of belonging was higher. I feel like I belong at school. 2015, relatively low levels. 2003, that was still higher. So there is something, we can't give you a clear explanation for this, but it's something to worry that actually the student sense of belonging in most countries has been deteriorating. And that is what you can see also here on average across countries. We also see that even though most students feel a sense of belonging at school, that's sometimes not the case for students with an immigrant background. You can see here, for example, and when I talk about a difference of 0.5 on the scale, that's half a standard deviation on this. It's really a lot, and you can see in the Slovak Republic, former Yugoslavic Republic, Macedonia, Dominican Republic, Iceland, and so on. There you can see basically there's quite a big gap between the sense of belonging of immigrant and non-immigrant students. But once again, you go to the right side, and you can see that's not an issue in Singapore, New Zealand, Kazakhstan, UAE, the Netherlands, Australia, Qatar. So it's not universal, but it's a pattern that we can clearly see in the majority of countries. The bar goes up. That means immigrants feel less of a sense of belonging than non-immigrants. Again, we see also that student sense of belonging relates in important ways to teacher support. And what I show you here is the figure after controlling for social background. Because, of course, you can think about this being an artifact of the kind of social environment. But even when you can take this into account, you can see that in some countries on the left side, you have students reporting is 3 times more likely a greater sense of belonging when they feel that teachers supported them. So again, teacher support, the perceived teacher support is a very important predictor for students to be feeling at home at school. Discipline, also something that will not surprise you. In countries where there is a stronger disciplinary climate, generally students report a higher sense of belonging. It's not true everywhere, but it's true in the majority of countries. And interestingly, it's almost the same after accounting for student social and also the school social economic profile. So this is not, again, reflecting the social environment of the school, but the disciplinary climate in itself, where teachers succeed to create, a strong sense of commitment to learning, a very positive learning climate, all of that. There you can really see that it seems to translate also in a higher sense of belonging, in whatever way the causal nature of that relationship goes. In turn, where students perceive their teachers to be unfair to them, they are much more likely to feel to be outsiders. And again, that's true to some extent after accounting for social background, but certainly a lot before accounting for it, which suggests that the socioeconomic profile is a really important predictor for this phenomenon. That was about teachers. That was about schools. Let's have a look at parents. Our data also shows some really interesting findings on the parent factor. Here you can see on this chart basically the impact that parents' activities have on students' life satisfaction. This is based on 18 countries for which we have comparative data. What you can see, for example, if parents spend time just talking to their child, you can see that students are 60% more likely to report high levels of life satisfaction. And I'm saying this because, often we equate parental engagement with, doing hours of homework with your child, or, having yourself an academic degree so that you can explain things to your child. But that's actually not what these data show. They suggest that it's just the social engagement that actually leads to the much greater degree of life satisfaction. Also, parents eating the dinner with their children at home, 50% more likely to be happy with your life. Discuss how well my child is doing at school, and parental engagement in schools activities are also related to life satisfaction in an important way. This is a social side, but there's also an academic side to this, and I think that's really interesting as well. When you see, for example, when parents spend time just talking to their child, you see students coming out 19 points better on the PISA assessment. And that's basically more than half a school year advantage. Even when you discount social background, you still have 10 points of an advantage. And that's more than most school factors that we measure in PISA. So actually, the social engagement of parents with their children is an important predictor for the life satisfaction of children and also for their performance on PISA. Now, don't ask me what the causal nature of that relationship. That's not something that we can discern. But what these data do suggest is that this interaction between parents and students is really important. And it's something that is not excessively demanding of parents. It's something that we should be able to expect from every parent. Here you also, parents' interest in their child's activities at school. Simply giving your child a sense that what you do in school matters to me. Where that happens, you can see that students are 2.5 times more likely to want top grades at school. You can see that students are actually 1.9 times more likely to be very satisfied with their life. And at the same time, you can see it reduces the likelihood by 3.4 times to feel lonely at schools, and by twice for not being satisfied with life. So you can really see that just showing your child that what they do in school is something that is relevant to you, that interests you, that is already a very important predictor for life satisfaction, but also student sense of belonging. Physical activities at schools, there's a lot of variability in this. You can see on the left side of the chart, in some countries, students go to sports more than three days per week in school. In others, it's more 2 days, 1 day, it's none. And but you can see there's a lot of variability across countries. The United States is an interesting country where a lot of students do a lot of sports, but actually a lot of students also do no sports. So it varies both within countries, it varies between countries. Now, what did we find about a relationship with life satisfaction? Well, what you can see here on the chart is that moderate physical activities seems to be a good predictor for life satisfaction. For vigorous physical activities, that's the yellow diamond, that's actually even more pronounced. Again, we don't know what the causal nature is. It could well be that students who are happy with life or also want to do more sports, or it could be that students who do more sports end up to be more happy in life, or there may be other factors involved. But you can see it's a quite consistent relationship, a pattern that we see across countries, a relationship between physical activity and life satisfaction. And it's not just happiness in life. You can also say that the days of physical activity outside of school, now this is now not inside school, but outside school, actually also relate to learning outcomes in school. It's true for moderate physical activity, a little less so for more vigorous physical activity. Now, but what you can see on this chart is basically that students who spend more time doing sports out of their school do better in science inside their school. Often we see that all a zero-sum game, let's not waste any time, let's make sure that students spend all of their time learning. But in fact, what these data do suggest, a good balance in different activities can be most conducive to better learning outcomes. The last chapter is the most unhappy one in our report, and this is about bullying. The first thing that we can see is that actually Bullying in its sort of most extreme form, I was threatened by other students. That's not so common. It's 3-4%, or other students took away or destroyed things that belonged to me. Still about 4%. I got hit or pushed around by other students. These kind of things are not very frequent. 3-4 students, 3-4% of students, but that's still, one in a class. So again, it's something. Even if these are not big numbers, it's a phenomenon that is everywhere. We also should, see bullying not just a phenomenon for the student who is bullied. That's what you see on the chart here. But it's also something that, it creates a climate of fear in schools that is relevant for the bystanders. Bystanders is also relevant for, the perpetrators in sense. So these numbers are significant. But when you look at the more psychological or relational aspects of bullying, other students left me out on purpose. Here you already talk about, 6-7%. Other students made fun of me. It's over 10%. And when you sum it all up, it's almost 20% of students that are exposed to some form of bullying. So it's not a rare phenomenon, and these data do suggest that schools need to do more to actually engage in a zero-tolerance policy, to make this a whole-of-school activity, to not, think this is a sort of marginal phenomenon that doesn't need to be everybody's business. It's really something that it's not, it's something that we should look at carefully. It also varies across countries. You can see that there are countries like Latvia, New Zealand, Singapore, Macau, Australia, United Kingdom, where actually bullying is quite frequent. Whereas there are others on the right side of the chart where we don't see actually the exposure to bullying is that frequent. We see some gender gap in this. It's not very large, but it varies. Overall, you can say boys are more frequently the subject of bullying. We talk about 1 in 5 boys. But when it comes to, for example, other students spread nasty rumors about me, kind of psychological bullying, they see more girls. So it varies across the different categories, but the gender differences overall are not that substantial. Now, one question that we ask ourselves is, is this just happening for students with low performance results? Everybody laughs about them and so on, but actually, you can see it's more prevalent. Bullying is more prevalent among very low performing students in the first and second and third decile, but the lines become pretty flat. Other students made fun of me. It doesn't make much of a difference whether you are in the 4th or in the 10th decile. So that also affects the highest performers. Other students spread nasty rumors about me. It's a little less for highest performers, but then again, the physical bullying, it's very high among the 1st and 2nd decile, but even it doesn't flatten out. It then flattens out and doesn't continue to decrease. So it's not a phenomenon that just affects low-performing students. It can affect high-performing students as well. It's something that relates to schools' disciplinary climate. That's one of the things that we see very clearly, that the exposure to bullying is much greater in schools with a negative disciplinary climate. And that's even true after accounting for the social background of students in school. And that's important, because often we would attribute this simply to, kind of negative climate. But actually, even after accounting for this, you can see those kinds of effects. Students' perceptions of teachers' fairness is also an important predictor. Where students basically perceive their teachers to be unfair, they're unfairly harsh to them, they don't recognize these things. You can see exposure to bullying is greater. A lot of that is explained by social background. You can see that here by the gap between the yellow and the blue symbols. But still, even after accounting for school characteristics, teachers' unfairness is an important, or perceived unfairness is an important factor. Now, how does it affect other outcomes? And this is actually quite interesting. You can see where students are more frequently bullied. They expect to end their education as soon as they can. They feel more like an outsider. They are not satisfied with life. Life satisfaction is clearly associated with the frequency of being bullied. They skip school, or they feel anxious for a test. Test anxiety is also quite importantly related to this. Last but not least, you can also see that parents can make a big difference here. It's not just the responsibility of schools, where parents help with difficulties in schools. You can see that students are much less likely to say that other students left me out of things on purpose, other students made fun of me, I was threatened by other students, and all the different forms of bullying that we observe. So again, it's a climate of awareness of the students' perception that we are all in this together. This is a whole of society project, education in school. There you can really see it has positive relations on life outcomes, and it has very important relations also on the students' well-being in school. That's all I wanted to share with you, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Yes, we have several questions from our participants. The first one is a general question. Can you speak to how life satisfaction was measured in this PISA assessment?
Yeah, in this case, we basically ask students to rate their satisfaction with life on a scale from 1 to 10, and so it's a subjective assessment of life satisfaction. It's different from when we measure things like sense of belonging, where we have basically a set of very specific questions to which we ask students to respond, and then we construct an index. Life satisfaction here generally is basically just the student's perception of how satisfied they are with their lives on a rating scale.
Thank you. Another question we have, can you speak a bit more precisely about the precise things that teachers can do to make students feel they are supported? Are these things, are they related to the classroom or school environment, or more specifically to one-on-one teacher-student relationships? In other words, what do we mean by being more or less supportive?
Yeah, actually, what we measure here is the student's perception of teacher support. You know, my teacher understands my strengths and weaknesses. My teacher is there for me when I need help. My teacher adapts the difficulty of the lesson to the needs of the students, and so on. It's a perception of teacher support. Now, what teachers can do to achieve this, there are various things. It has, first of all, to do with pedagogical practice. And the teachers have a good sense of, how students learn differently and differently at different stages, that teachers can see when students face obstacles, that they don't just do one lesson for a whole class, but they're very good in tailoring instruction for individual students' needs. That's something that Finnish teachers, for example, learn from the first day of their teacher education. They have a lot of training in psychology, cognitive psychology. There's a lot of actually effort devoted to, addressing individual needs of students. That's the instructional part. But it is also a very important relational aspect. You have some countries where teachers, just stand in the class, deliver lessons, whereas in other countries, teachers spend a substantial amount of their working time caring for students. And again, that can be a very effective way to relate to students, to basically build that kind of fabric in a school. It's also one of the things that we note is that teacher collaboration is very important, when often it's not possible for you as a single teacher to really understand the learning needs of an individual student. But when teachers in the school collaborate with each other to diagnose the learning needs of students and tailor their support, share basically among themselves the way in the province of Ontario in Canada, there is a student success teacher in every school. There is a very specific responsibility to moderate that process. So I think there are many things that relate to that degree of teacher support.
Thank you. We received several questions about bullying. The first, in the figures about bullying, we include incidents like being excluded from activities or being made fun of, which this participant suggests make up for a large part of the reported incidents of bullying. This participant asks, is this not exaggerating the problem of bullying, which of course is a serious one and has to be addressed?
Well, actually, the report actually differentiates quite carefully between different forms of bullying. Physical bullying, that's obviously the most extreme form of bullying, but also it looks at relational and it looks at kind of more psychological bullying. Why do we include those factors? because we do see that they have a very important relationship with life satisfaction, with student sense of belonging, with a sense of continuing working in school, with learning outcomes. So it's not just the most extreme form of bullying, the physical bullying, that has those kinds of negative connotations. And I think this is part of the challenge for schools, that it's very easy to recognize, when the student was hit, when you have a bloody nose, whatever, that's something that we can actually easily identify, easily deal with. Whereas the kind of more subtle forms of bullying are harder to detect, harder to address, but they're not less important in terms of the social outcomes. So if you're interested in, the individual features of bullying, you'll find all of that in the book. But it's, in our view, important to look at this in a more fine-grained and nuanced way, and not just reduce the perception to one form of bullying.
And a related question, does PISA tell us anything about cyberbullying? Are there higher rates of bullying in countries where internet use is also high?
It's a very good question. Unfortunately, we have not been able to pose that question in that specific form, so I can't answer that.
And is there any relationship between the incidence of bullying and class size? And if there is there anything that teachers specifically can do about this?
Well, if you look at this at face value, I wouldn't say so, because actually in some of the countries with the largest classes, we don't see much of incidence of bullying. So I think, I don't think you could say at the aggregate level there is a relationship, but I think what is probably more an issue is to what extent teachers have the resources, the time, and the training to actually engage with students on an individual basis. And that can be an artifact of class size, but not necessarily.
On a slightly different topic, concerning physical activities, do you perceive that the differences in physical activities between boys and girls, can that explain some of the difference in life satisfaction between these two groups of students?
It's an interesting question. This is something we should be able to study with the data that we have, but we haven't really discussed it in the report. And but I also, I think it's certainly worth looking into this. But I also think one would need to look at more general aspects. These are 15-year-olds. They may look differently at their lives. There may be other factors, that influence the perception of themselves, and that may not so much be related just to what they do at schools or the kind of sports. But again, interesting question. We should look at that.
Another question, do we have any examples, does PISA have any good examples from countries where students report low anxiety? Is there any case studies or any specific factors that are common to countries where students have lower anxiety towards their schoolwork?
Yeah, I mentioned some of the countries that are really interesting experience in this, where you can see, for example, again, Switzerland, Germany, Finland, the Netherlands, Estonia, they don't have that much of anxiety. The one common factor that we see among these countries is that motivation is often more intrinsic, that students own their learning processes. They want to do well because the subject is interesting to them, because they see their future in this. There is less emphasis on competitive motivation. I want to do better than others, which is what we see more closely associated with anxiety. But, I think this is just the beginning of the analysis. I think we need to look at much closer into why those countries do succeed. The one thing that I can say very, very clearly here is that, for example, when it's concerning test anxiety, this has nothing to do with the number of tests that a country does. Some of the high testing countries, like the Netherlands, actually still have very low levels of anxiety. Probably teachers are very good to help students understand that assessment and evaluation is not a tool of control, has a formative purpose, help students learn better, help teachers teach better, help schools to become more effective. And maybe those countries are better in, introducing assessments that, start with easy tasks, then get challenge students more and more. So I think it's probably a lot to do with the way in which we structure those kinds of experiences. But again, it deserves further study.
Thank you. Does PISA have any data about whether students in private schools are happier than students in public schools or vice versa?
Actually, we do not find, once you control for social background, we do not find systematic differences between the schools. That's true for life satisfaction, that's true for sense of belonging, and that's true even for student learning outcomes.
Another participant asks how PISA measures disciplinary climate in school.
Yeah, we basically look at things, how many minutes of instruction is lost at the beginning of the class, is there an orderly and sort of climate in the class, can students concentrate well, we look at social relationships in the classroom, so we look at all of those factors that actually shape an orderly and productive learning climate.
Another of our participants asks whether it's possible to tell through the PISA results whether there's any correlation between student well-being and schools that provide student counseling or coaching.
It's an interesting question. I don't think we have studied that in the report. I'm not even sure we would have data on individual student counseling, but I can't tell you.
Okay, and another question. Is it possible to say from the PISA data which is more important for student life satisfaction, school or family relationships?
Those are very important, and actually the strength of the relationship for both is much higher than what we would have anticipated and expected, and it's much higher than the impact of most school factors. There's a lot that parents can do, there's a lot that teachers can do, and we should, I think the lesson for me in this report is really that we should, view teachers appreciate the work of teachers in a much more holistic way than just reducing it to the hours of instruction that they provide. And the same for parents. The simple fact that parents engage with the schoolwork of their children, that they value education, that they give their children a clear signal that what they do in school matters to them. All of those things have a profound impact on learning outcomes and life satisfaction. Again, we can't discern from this whether that relationship is causal, but the simple fact that there is a relationship suggests that we should look at those patterns.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I think that's all we have time for today. To all of our participants, I want to thank you very much for your interest in the OECD's work on education. We invite you to visit the PISA website, www.oecd.org/PISA, where you'll find the report on students' well-being, the first 2 volumes of the 2015 results, current and archived issues of PISA in Focus, data visualizations, videos about PISA in general and about the 2015 results in particular, and information about this and forthcoming webinars. This webinar has been recorded and will be available in a couple of days on our website, www.oecd.org/PISA/webinars. Once again, thank you very much for joining us.